Welcome to The Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark Gods Rise, Chapter 12 of Gods and Men. Behind the shield erected by the gods, Staravan felt another priest die and doubled over in pain. The deities on either side of him stepped closer, barricading the gap with intertwined arms. Seeing the shield would hold, Staravan faded from the world of Toromar. As he went, he looked down at the Old One's temple in Deverath and knew there was nothing he could do to save what was left of his priests. Closing away the vision of the world, he blocked it from his mind, cutting the connection to his priests so he could not feel their loss. They would join him soon enough. Retiring to the hot springs in the realm of the gods, he found himself a secluded corner and wept. As Toromar faded from view and his power faded from the world, the other deities watched as the Old One drew more strength from the capital's temple. They gritted their teeth against the loss of so many priests and sent silent exhortations to their followers for assistance. A wave of prayer and belief answered their demand, its power strengthening them so they could strengthen their buckling shield. It was a relief when Walshira's attack faltered, growing less powerful as something else drew his attention. Adriel, the god of problem solving, was the first to see what had taken the Old One's focus from them. East of Wildergen, east of the river, where twisted elementals bound to Walshira's will erupted from the river banks. Their serpentine forms carved swathes through the forest, making nature's deities groan in dismay. The sound was enough to pull the Old One's attention back to the shield, and he struck again. He might even have broken through if Leganos had not arrived and joined the shield. Murderer! The outraged demon hissed, pushing him back with the shield. Thief! He screamed, lashing out at the Old One's darkness. Walshira laughed, despite wincing at the demon's blow. If I am a thief and a murderer, he chuckled, then what do you call yourself? Leganos didn't acknowledge his retort, but lifted his voice, addressing the deities holding the shield. Your people are almost clear, and dawn is but an hour away. See to your chosen, or Staravan's loss will have been in vain. So saying, he focused his power into the shield, sending dark lines of demonic magic through the golds and silvers and greens of powers from a purer source. But strengthening their defences wasn't all he did. As soon as the shield was stable, he drew a little of the blended power back and lashed out again. This time the Old One screamed, tearing his attention from his minions in the forests to focus on the shield. When the demon taking their place, with the demon taking their place in the line, the gods of nature acted. In the forest, Raomar felt Staravan's withdrawal and groaned in dismay. Pain at the loss of a second god so soon after being bound to his service made him want to cry out, but he stifled the urge, the sudden emptiness in his soul almost too much to bear. The large, well-built warrior walking beside him glanced anxiously at him and laid a huge hand on his shoulder. It's nothing, Grunwald, Raomar told him, laying a hand over the big man's fingers. Nothing. Grunwald frowned, but when Raomar lifted his hand, the warrior stepped away, reaching for his blade. Raomar pivoted to see what had drawn his attention, turning in time to see the big man leap toward the bushes slightly ahead of them. The Northman's blade gleamed dully in the muted glow of light reflected from the clouds. Its arc flashed as the bushes rustled and an earthweird erupted onto the path before them. The Northman's blade cleaved into its head and it reared back with a roar. Behind me, Grunwald ordered, interposing himself between the weird and the small group travelling with him. As he spoke, Raomar heard another voice raised, but this time not in command or protest. This time one of the apprentices spoke, invoking a spell of protection even as her mistress's voice rose in a shriek of arcane denial. Elemental magic surged around them, answering Alessia's call, even as the more structured form of learned arcana sought to set a barrier between them. Raomar reached for his Staravan and again felt nothing. Cursing softly under his breath, he pulled the miniature crossbow from the pouch at his belt. Still cursing, he pulled 4 of his largest bolts from the bandolier he still wore around his waist. Staravan, I need you, he prayed. I need these bolts to purify the poisoned earth and poison the defiled monster it has become. He loaded the first quarrel into the bow. Staravan. Maybe it was a punishment for keeping the bow and the bandolier. He'd intended to hang it up when Staravan accepted him, and he'd worn it out of habit to the exchange ceremony. He figured the god would understand. And I never found out what he thought of it, he mused, loading the crossbow before turning his thoughts skyward. Staravan, where are you? First you demand my presence, and then you vanish from everywhere you're meant to be. Where are you? The messenger found Staravan in his secluded corner in the pools of the gods. Even with Staravan slumped in the pool, half concealed by rock and wreathed in steam, the messenger knew exactly where to look. It picked its way over the hot rocks and boulders surrounding the pools, occasionally flexing its wings to make a short hop over a stream or lake rather than having to follow a longer path around. In no time at all, he'd landed beside the deity. Lord of gods, it intoned, this will never do. Staravan slowly raised his head. What? He asked, and the messenger saw the darkness surrounding the deity's eyes and the gaunt sorrow in his face. The god's voice creaked with tears, and he looked tired. Who sent you? He wondered. Who can send the messengers but the chief of gods? He didn't ask it out loud, and the question went unanswered. Your chosen, the messenger began without preamble. The one you have chosen to aid you in your fight is in need. All my priests are in need, Staravan tiredly pointed out. But this one is in danger of death, and if he falls, then so does your pantheon and your world. I am tired, Staravan replied, slowly pulling himself from the water and reaching for the robe set well away from its edge. Nevertheless, the messenger replied, and authority snapped through its tone. Staravan tensed. The Lord of Gods pulled his robe over his head and let it fall about him before turning to face the creature. Who sent you? The messenger tilted its head, but not because of anything Staravan had done. It looked more like it was listening to another voice, something speaking from beyond their current plane. Staravan studied it as it listened, noting when it dipped its beak as though agreeing with something. He saw when its gaze sharpened and its attention returned to him. Wear you, lest the disaster that followed our own carelessness befalls you and all those under your care. Be cautious and look to your survival, lest your fall be more complete than ours. The messenger flexed its wings as though ignorant of Staravan's stare. Beware, it intoned, unfurling its wings and gauging the sky. Wait, Staravan said, half reaching for it before remembering he could not touch it, and withdrawing his hand. With a single powerful sweep of its wings, it leapt to the sky and was gone. For a long moment, Staravan studied the point at which it had disappeared, and then, reluctantly, he returned his attention to the world. It was as if he'd opened a floodgate. Prayers crashed over him like a wave, and not just from his priests, but from the people around them. Pleas for his return, pleas that he not turn his back on them, pleas that he intervene. A moment of silence followed their contact, as if those praying sensed his presence. And then the prayers renewed in force, thanks for his return, and more pleas for his aid. It was a small matter to send a sense of his presence over them, a simple thing to give them a sense of peace and reassurance. It was a much larger thing not to withdraw entirely. When the deluge settled once more, he searched for the Kavarak he had chosen. Raomar stilled in shock as the god answered. I approve, Staravan reassured him, then indicated the weirds. But you will need something more for these. He studied his newest servant, and a smile lit his voice. I see you still have the weapon you used in the service to my daughter. My lord. Raomar bowed his head, expecting rebuke, but Staravan didn't sound disappointed. Then we will use the weapon with which you are most effective, Staravan told him. Take the bolts and hold them before you. Raomar did as he was bidden, raising the bolts above his bowed head. Moonlight struck the uplifted nocks, encapsulating them in silver light that flowed over the veins and down the arrow shaft, but not before gloving his hand and flowing through his skin to the reservoir within. Raomar didn't see it, but his companions watched as the moonlight faded, and the priest gleamed in a momentary shell of silver. Grunwald took a step back, prepared to throw himself toward the forest if his rage rose. It didn't, and the silver light faded, seeping into Raomar's skin and leaving nothing but the beast elf's usually mottled shadow behind. When the elf opened his eyes, the light was still there, silver flooding the usual amber as the priest knelt and stabbed 3 of the gleaming bolts into the ground next to his knee. The 4th he loaded into the small but powerful weapon that had served him so well as an assassin. Ignoring Grunwald's puzzled look, Raomar took aim, waiting for a clear view of the first weird's head. As soon as it raised it to roar, he loosed the bolt and reloaded. He put the second bolt to flight before the first had landed. The third followed as the first struck, and the beast roared with pain. Silver lightning cobwebbed its head, arcing up from its throat to form a lacework of deadly strands around it. The earth weird twisted away from the path, writhing in pain and scattering dirt and foliage as it went. Raomar loaded a 4th bolt, scanning the forest for another target. His first target vanished in a shower of earth and leaves, but he found nothing more to target, and then the forest itself began to work against him. Bushes grew thicker, weaving their branches together, and magic sparkled along their leaves and branches in droplets of green. Soon the undergrowth had formed an impenetrable barrier across the path, and the earth had mounded itself to form a solid rampart beneath them. The trees swept their branches low to bar an aerial path, and the deities of nature breathed their strength into their defence. Raomar saw the bushes shake and heard another weird roar in frustration at being denied passage. He lowered his crossbow, bowing his head and breathing a prayer of thanks to Staravan. When he was done, he raised his head to see how his friends were faring. Alessia had let her most recent chant fade, and some of the fierceness had faded from her expression, while the lightnings flickered less fiercely along her body. It was like watching her wake up as the awareness of her surroundings returned to her face. He also saw the fatigue that crashed around her and scrambled to his feet, reaching out to steady her, careless of the last few flickers of wild magic arcing around her. Around them, the sound of other chants also died away. Scanning his people, Raomar saw Ruranith's gaze sharpen as the shapeshifter focused on the raised wall of earth and plants surrounding them. Beyond the wall, the weirds still raged, their roars of frustration muted by the barrier. Let's not tarry. Brianda's voice was sharp with fatigue and served to bring them back to the reality of their flight. Ruranith nodded. This way, he instructed, stepping out along the path. He hesitated before the barrier, but the forest sensed his approach, and branches unwove as earth parted to grant them passage. Ahead of that unweaving, the barrier grew and reformed so that its protection continued. This time, the deities of nature kept pace, guarding their every step. From his distant vantage point, while Shira observed the barricade, noting the hallowed earth protecting the base of it. They dare, he thought, his anger snarling through his prison as he watched the fruitless rantings and struggles of his weirds as they tried to reach the Kavarag and his companions. Reluctantly, he turned his eyes from the scene and assessed the power that remained available to him. More than half of it had been wasted, and there were too few priests remaining to give him the power needed to deconsecrate the barrier of hallowed earth. He screamed, sending a wail of destruction against the shield raised by the deities protecting the village. The sound promised destruction for Laganos, along with the gods with whom he'd chosen to side. Launching one last vindictive strike against the shield, while Shiro returned to the temple, where he noted there were 2 pillars still untouched, the waiting priests so overloaded with horror they could not bring themselves to fear him any more. While Shira read the resignation on their faces and knew he'd lost any further chance of harvest from them. Allowing his gaze to travel around the temple, he arrived at the girl still chained to the altar. His interest sharpened, and he moved closer to study what she offered. Magic stretched along every fibre of her being, the sight of it rousing his appetite and giving him renewed hope. There was enough energy within her that he would be able to widen the breach in his prison. It wouldn't be enough to allow him to escape, but it would bring the day of that escape closer than it had ever been. All that would remain once he drained the power from her would be for him to capture the wizardess and the apprentice, Sindra. Once that had been done, his escape was assured. Then let the gods stand against me. Kill the priests, he ordered, not caring who overheard him, deity or man. They have surrendered all bar their souls. I have no further use for them. He was surprised to feel a renewed burst of terror at his words. So they can still feel fear, although not for long, he noticed, as the king ended their lives. But that extra burst had been unexpectedly sweet. Perhaps I should let intended sacrifices hear my voice more often. While Shira paused, taking the time to refresh himself in the dying emotions of those on the pillars, and then he turned his attention to Xanthia. Now, he said, addressing her directly, I have need of you. He didn't expect her to send a sudden, desperate plea to Sophriel as he descended toward her, nor could he prevent it escaping the boundaries of the temple, or the goddess from hearing it. What he did not see was how that goddess reacted when it reached her. Above the temple of Wildergen, where the deities held their line against the Old One's depredations, the goddess of magic paused as Xanthia's shriek reached her ears. I must go, she said, laying her palm against Adriel's cheek. Adriel shook his head, well aware of what she'd heard. You cannot, he replied. The Old One lies in wait for you. He will not let you take her unscathed. Sophriel smiled. No, she said gently. It is you who do not understand. I am not what is important. It is the Old One's defeat that is important. Not even my death can change that. But if you are dead, you can't continue to aid us, Adriel protested. And we need you alive, helping us defend this world and all that rely on it. You are the caretaker of magic, its forms, and all who use it. There is no one else. How can the life of a mere girl compare to that? Sophriel pursed her lips, then cupped his face in her hands, resting her forehead against his. Dear, dear Adriel, she said, don't you understand? If the Old One takes that mere girl's life, he's only one, at most two, steps away from freeing himself. I cannot let him take her soul. She pulled her head away, stroking her hands along his cheeks as she released him. This is one battle I have to fight. But don't worry. The one who gave me my power has already chosen my successor, and it is she you should be protecting. For where I am just your sister, she could be your wife. I wouldn't trade you for all the wives in the world, Adriel told her. I'd live my days a bachelor and have you alive and safe before I took any wife your death provided. He took her hands. Don't go. Sophriel stepped away. You know that not even the gods can change what the powers before have said will be. They no longer command our realms, Adriel protested. They gave them up long ago. That's as may be, Sophriel tartly returned, but their retreat did not blind them to the events that unfold around us, even if they are powerless to stop them. So they warned you of the consequences, Adriel said. Sophriel shook her head. No, but my sight is linked to theirs, and even I know this is what must be. Even deities make mistakes, Adriel told her. You can't be sure. She snorted at that. Our mistakes are few and far between, and any errors made by the powers before are fewer still. She looked toward Deverath and gently pulled her fingers free of his grasp. I must go. At first he resisted letting go, but then relented. She was his sister, but she was also a fully fledged deity in her own right and knew her realm better than any. If the powers before said she had to go, then go she must. I will watch over you, he whispered as she vanished from before him. I must. A feathery rustle came from behind him, and he turned, disrupting the scry he'd started on the Old One's Devarath temple. The messenger touching down behind him was an unexpected sight. You cannot watch over her, it stated, arranging its wings over its back and continuing before he could protest. Your calling lies elsewhere, and I have come to take you there. But I must watch over her, Adriel protested. And see her die? The creature demanded. It snapped its beak in annoyance. You will do her no good here, and your part for the future is vital. It flared its wings, clawing at the ground beneath them. You must come with me now. Adriel stared at it, finally noting its clawed feet and the metallic hue to its wings. Of all the messengers he'd seen, this one was different, as was the sense of authority radiating from its presence. With another glance toward Devarath, he took a step toward it. Who are you?